Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Planning Committee meeting. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Membership of the committee tonight is as listed in the agenda. We have apologies from Councillor Williams, and Councillor Lawrence, Councillor Greco and Councillor Newton are all on approved leaves of absence. Disclosures of conflicts of interest. Are there any disclosures? No disclosures. Confirmation of the minutes of the Planning Committee meeting held on the 20th of August 2018. It's moved by Councillor Messina, seconded by Councillor Rennie. All those in favour? Motion is carried. Next item is consideration of reports. 5.1, application for a planning permit at 33 Joffrey Street, Reservoir. Officers.
Thank you, Mayor. This application seeks approval to develop 6 dwellings in the form of 4 double-storey dwellings and 2 single-storey dwellings. 1 dwelling contains 4 bedrooms, 3 dwellings contain 3 bedrooms, and 2 dwellings contain 2 bedrooms each. The 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings all have access to a double-width garage. The 2 bedroom dwellings each have access to a single garage. The dwellings are constructed with lightweight cladding, brick, metal cladding and render. This application does not include any reduction in the car parking requirements. Vehicle access is via 2 single-width crossovers, with the existing single-width crossovers being removed. The site is proximate public transport in the form of the Route 86 tram along Planning Road, approximately 400 metres to the southeast. The subject land is located within the general residential zone, and the site has an area of 1,520 square metres and sits within a residential context. The site is affected by a restrictive covenant that relates to quarrying and brick making, and the proposal does not breach this covenant. The notice of the application has been conducted with 14 objections being received. The objections are summarised and responded to on pages 9 to 13 of the agenda. The application complies with the requirements of Clause 2202 relating to neighbourhood character, Clause 5206 relating to car parking, and Clause 55 relating to Res Code. Accordingly, it is recommended that the application be supported, subject to the conditions contained in pages 3 to 7 of the agenda, and a notice of decision to grant a permit be issued.
Thank you. Okay, I'll now call on the applicant to present to the committee. Chris McKenzie.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the opportunity to present. It's been a little while since I had to do that, which suggests Council's processes have become a lot more streamlined than they were a few years ago, which is probably for everyone's benefit. This application, as you've had explained to you through the report and through what's just been said to you, comes after a previous refusal that went to VCAT that some of you may have recalled I was also involved with at that stage. VCAT upheld Council's refusal of the previous plans that had 8 dwellings, and all 8 of them were 2-storey. And if you're sort of looking up at the screen there, on the bottom of the page, which is the southern side, there were elements that were at 1 metre and also elements that were on the boundary. So there was a much greater sense that the built form was more intense through the site and closer to boundaries, and the first floor elements continued right the way through the site. And those elements were really the critical areas where VCAT said that previous set of plans hadn't struck the right balance in terms of change that is supported by policy, but also an acknowledgement of the character and the surrounding neighbours. And the process that happens when a refusal comes out of VCAT is an applicant is entitled to come back to council, and there's a sense of expectation that they might, but there's a very strong sense that they should actually pay attention and understand what VCAT said were the flaws and have meaningful solutions and responses to them. So this set of plans that has now come through with your council officers' support with a recommendation for approval has made some very significant responses to the VCAT refusal. Clearly the first one is that from 8 dwellings it's been reduced to 6, but also it's been reduced to 6 where the 2 at the rear are now single-storey dwellings. So there's a response where the 2-storey form now only comes through sort of the front 2/3 of the site, where on the south you can see there's quite a lot of built form, that grey shaded, against the boundary. Unit 5 and then Unit 2 on the north are the 2-storey, and then you have 2 yards that face each other, which become an actual garden break, and then you have single-storey dwellings behind. So the concerns that VCAT expressed last time have been resolved and reviewed with your planners, with a very significant reduction in the amount of built form, particularly as it's read around that whole rear section where there are 4 or 5 neighbour interfaces, so that now the single-storey form plus the garden setbacks become a much more balanced response to the context than the 8 2-storey dwellings that were refused previously. I won't go through every element of the officer's report. They've worked in detail with the applicants through the process to come up to the point where the council planners are satisfied with their recommendation for approval. The recommendations don't involve any significant redesign. It's just fairly typical type conditions, and I would commend the report and the recommendation to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mackenzie. You can return to your seat in the gallery. I don't have any objectors registered to speak, so I just wanted to check there was no one else that wanted to address the committee. Any of the objectors? Yes?
Sorry, I wasn't registering time, but I'm actually a resident of the street.
Okay. And you didn't want to present to the committee?
Is that okay if I just say a couple of words?
Yep, that's fine. If we would just get your name. Yep. So you did put in a formal objection?
Yeah, I did.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, my name's Sean Connolly, just a resident from Joffre Street. You've obviously got the objections in front of you, and I'm not familiar with the processes with the planning and approval of the plans, but all I could just ask is sometimes it's difficult to visualise the plans and the streetscape by looking at overhead maps for Google and plans, but if you had the opportunity to drive up Joffre Street and have a look at the streetscape, you'll find it, at the moment already, it's very congested. There's been issues with the church in the street with parking matters. There's been mediation attempted with residents down the southern end of the street, and it gets that congested that you can't actually drive into the street properly. Across the road from us at number 21 Joffre Street is a residential house, and they had up to 7 cars, with the majority of those parked on the street. I know properties are required to have off-street parking, but the issues already in the street with parking are going to be congested even further. So what we've got down the southern end will make the northern end absolutely congested, and the street already has marked parking bays, and I'm not aware of many other streets, say in the Darebin area, even in the congested Northcote area, that have marked parking bays actually in the street. And this is quite a typical residential street, which is now required to have parking bays because it's that congested. With it, I think it's an overdevelopment of this particular property. It's a beautiful house the way it is, but with provided car parking already provided, the top end of the street is going to become congested. There's a lot of kids that walk or transgress down to Preston Primary. Yeah, as I said, I think it's just an overdevelopment for this particular area. I'm not against developing, but in general, but I just think in this particular street, it's already congested, and having a development like this is just be over the top in a sense for a smaller residential street. And as I said, if you had the opportunity to drive down the street and just have a look at the streetscape, you'll find that it is congested, and hopefully that the application would be supported, is what I'm saying, if you had that opportunity.
Great. Thank you for presenting to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, do you have any questions? Councillor Messina.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'd like to put a question to the officers in terms of VCAT hearings. Has street congestion been a significant factor in objecting to a planning application, please?
Officers?
The objection.
Yeah, I can answer. It's not something that's routinely considered by VCAT in this type of context. What we're required to do and what VCAT will do is look at the parking provision and look at what the site's impacts are within its existing context. The assessment with this application is the full quota of car parking is provided on site, and there's been no real net loss of on-street parking capacity as a result of the development, even though there's 2 crossovers. So the other thing to note too is that the lot's equivalent to a double frontage. So we've provided referral as planning application to the transport team. They do look at those broader context considerations. Their professional view is that the application and proposal is supportable. And I would see that would be a similar view held by VCAT. But it's very unusual for VCAT to concentrate on a congestion issue when a full quota of parking's been provided on site.
Thank you.
I have a supplementary question. If you have a look at the garages as detailed in the plan, in your opinion, what size vehicles would fit? Is that a standard side garage, number one? And number two, what standard size vehicles would fit into that garage? Would there be a 4-wheel drive perhaps, or just a small little mini vehicle?
The double garages and the single garages are both within the standard requirements in terms of lengths and widths. The actual requirement relates to a B85, which I believe is like a Commodore.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Councillor Rennie.
Through you, Mayor Lassurf. I understand there are a couple of significant trees in the front yard of that block. Are they going to be retained, or is there other planting that would replace those kind of trees?
The proposed trees within the front setback are to be removed to accommodate the vehicle access way through the middle of the site. The application has been referred to Council's arboricultural unit, who have advised that the trees can be removed subject to the replacement planting, which is included as a recommended condition.
If I could you give more detail about replacement planting and what that might look like?
We are proposing a condition to require a minimum of 2 medium-sized canopy trees and 6 small-sized canopy trees.
5D.
Thank you.
Which condition was that, sorry? Oh, 1D.
Condition 5D.
5D. Yep, please. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Councillor Rennie.
I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation to give notice to grant a planning permit.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Rennie, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank Chris for coming along and speaking to this, and particularly Sean also for taking the time to come and speak to us tonight. It's very useful to hear from residents. I've looked quite closely at these plans and the level of compliance that they've achieved, and I think that's something we'd actually like to see more often. I do think it's worth noting that a site of this size, 1,500 metres squared, is actually able to accommodate 6 dwellings, and that the average per block piece of land is 250 metres on average. And actually we tend to get quite good planning outcomes when people are building townhouses on sites this size. So a couple of the things that I think are noteworthy and that I felt were good about the development are that it doesn't present a continuous built form the whole length, because at the first floor level there's separation between dwellings. The final 2 dwellings only being single storey does mean that in terms of the rear yard, the presentation of this development won't be significantly different from what it is at the moment, where there is a very large house on that block. And I think it's worth noting that in fact, a similar built form to this could be built without a planning permit at all if someone decided to actually build a much bigger house, a single house on the block. So in terms of what is permissible in terms of built form, I think that this is okay, and it certainly meets the garden area requirement, which I think is one of the things that's contributed to the building footprint on the land being acceptable. It's also unusual for us to see such a mix of dwelling diversity in terms of size when there's 6 units. So to see two bedroom units, three bedrooms and 1 4-bedroom, I think is really good, and I think it will create a really nice development with mixed unit size. And we don't see many 4-bedroom developments in this kind of proposal, and I think it's really commendable, because I actually do think that there are families looking for affordable 4-bedroom homes, and this will certainly be more affordable than a 4-bedroom home on a larger block. There's a diversity of bedroom sizes, and it certainly looks as though all of those bedrooms have good light into windows and things like that. So on that basis, I think it is worthy of support, and I once again thank those people who came along and spoke tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Rennie. Councillor McCarthy.
I'd also like to thank both the applicant's representative and the objector for their presentations. I just note, and I note that one of the key points that was raised by Sean was in relation to car parking, and we are faced with a situation where under the Planning Act we need to deal with each site on its own context, and can't actually, even though there is obviously a very clear issue there in terms of parking provision on the street, the application is compliant. The application is compliant with what is required, and because of its location, a visitor parking spot is not actually required. And I think we need to be wary of the fact that to make a decision that would be contrary to that would in effect actually open this up to going back to VCAT again. So we need to be aware of the fact that it is compliant on that front. Obviously, it's up to the residents if they wish to pursue a restricted parking regime. That is something that they can pursue. And of course, in that case, this site as a multi-unit dwelling, if approved, would not be eligible to on-street parking. So that is something for the residents to consider, and they can speak to the council's transport team about that. But we can't deal with that through the planning process. That's a separate council matter which needs to be taken up through that process. That may alleviate the broader issues, but in relation to this application, we need to take into account whether it's compliant, and it is compliant, as is clearly outlined in the report. I'd also just add to Councillor Rennie's comments in relation to the diversity of dwellings and the presentation. It is a large site, and I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that it can take this number of dwellings. So on that basis, I'm happy to support it.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? No? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. The Planning Committee has decided to grant this planning permit. The objector has 60 days in which to appeal. The objectors have 21, and a notice detailing tonight's decision will be sent to everybody in the coming week. Next item is 5.2, amendment of a development plan at 198 Beavers Road, Northcote. Officers.
Thank you. This matter is an amendment to a development plan that was approved by Council back in the 16th of April 2018. The reason for the changes being proposed and put forward in such a short space of time really arise out of some challenges in meeting the conditions of the development approval. around the accommodation of vehicles. The changes in the current proposal seek to change, or put another way, from townhouses to an apartment building typology. The specific change requested is a change to condition 1H of the current approval in April. And this relates to the dwelling yield being set at 95, and the request is to increase that up to 140. This will result in, this change will result in a greater mix of dwelling sizes from 2 to 4 bedrooms. Previously it was 3 and 4 bedrooms, so a greater diversity of housing sizes. It's important to also note that the application was supported by an update to the traffic report, and you'll note in pages 28 and 29 there's reference to an increase from 600 to 820 vehicles per day and a peak hourly traffic rate of 82 vehicles. As set out in the report, the increased densities remain within those that were contemplated when the site was rezoned as part of Amendment C122 in 2015. It's important to note that the development plan is essentially a conceptual stage. There are a lot of detailed considerations that will arise and will be addressed during the planning permit stage. As the report sets out, a similar approval, now a planning permit which is under construction, is occurring at 200 Beavers Road. The previous report, Council might recall, or the committee might recall, dealt with both sites in this area as a former landfill site, so those conditions that were dealt with in April and the current ones put forward deal with that aspect of contamination. And that provides a bit of a challenge for the site landscaping. Similar to the previous proposal, because there's an increased intensity proposed on the site, there was further notice provided. This has resulted in 3 submissions being received. These submissions are summarised and responded to also on page 28, and again they focus on traffic generation impacts. I remind you, similar to the April decision, there's a condition in place that requires that aspect to be looked at during the planning application, and that may result in some off-site works. So the changes promoted through the permit conditions I think ensure a reasonable outcome. The changes certainly provide a better response in terms of ground level activation, the design and the appearance of the proposed development. With that in mind, it is recommended that the amendment be supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudge. I'll call now on Claire, sorry I don't have your last name, to speak on behalf of the applicant. Okay.
I'm actually Blanche from Ratio. I think Claire might have filled in the form, so I'm Blanche Manuel. If you need to change the name, we don't want Claire being responsible for anything I've said. Oh, that's my 5 minutes started, has it? Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight, councillors. This is probably an application that's familiar to most of you. Obviously, it's been through a range of the planning processes from the 2015 rezoning, a number of iterations of the development plan, and obviously now a minor amendment that ultimately seeks to respond to concerns from the officers and provide for a better outcome at the site. So when the development plan application was approved, a planning application was submitted and was sort of running concurrently, but relied on development plan approval to enable councils to consider it. The development plan obviously deals with the broader issues, the massing of the building and broader considerations with respect to traffic and so on, and then the planning application is the more detailed assessment, setbacks, car parking, landscaping, design details. So council effectively undertook an assessment of the planning application, and some key concerns came from that. One of the main concerns was that the townhouse typology that was used throughout the development relied on garage car parking, which presented directly to the internal access ways. concerns were raised in terms of the dominance of those garages and the associated crossovers. So the project team sort of took a step back and said, how can we minimise those garage numbers? And really the solution was to include additional basement parking as well as an at-ground shared parking area that only require one access point per car parking area. In doing that, the typologies that previously relied on the garages became apartments, and that's resulted in the need for additional dwellings at the site. So fundamentally, the massing, the concept and the whole proposal remains the same. There is now a larger number of apartments or dwellings, but we see that as actually being a benefit and a good outcome for the proposal. It's in a residential growth zone and it's a really, really big site in a really good area. And we see this as an opportunity to provide a more, a greater range of housing types that depart from the 3-storey townhouses that were formerly proposed. We've now got additional 1- and 2-bedders that are more compact, as well as some townhouses as well. Importantly, a traffic assessment was done having regard to the increase of dwelling numbers from 95 to 140, and it was deemed that the proposal was well within the limits that the local network can handle, and that was also supported by Council's Traffic Engineering Department also. In terms of the parking, there's already a requirement on the development plan approval that you previously considered that requires compliance with clause 5206. So once the final design is put to the officers as part of the planning permit application, the development plan requirement already requires compliance in terms of the car parking rates. Really, that really summarises the proposal. It's a minor amendment to address concerns. We see it as being beneficial for the site and for the community, and hopefully you guys can support it so that we can move on to the next phase of the application. Thank you.
Thank you. You can return to your seat in the gallery. Now, I don't have any of the submitters to the amendment listed to speak to the committee, but I just wanted to check that there was no one here that wanted to say anything. No? Okay, councillors, do you have any questions? Councillor Messina.
Thank you, through Madam Mayor. I wanted to discuss item number 12I, collection of waste by private contractor. Given that Council are looking at implementing a food waste strategy, I'm just wondering how that would fit into the waste management strategy of this planning.
Mr Rudd.
Mayor Lassurf, I have to admit that's not something we turn our mind to at the development plan stage, but certainly as part of an assessment of a waste management plan, Council's policies at the time around that, and obviously the practical matters concerning collection are considered at that point. And it's not even determined yet at this stage whether it'll be private or public collection. So if there's a policy around food waste and better collection of it, then that's something that will be entered into during the planning permit considerations.
Great. Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor McCarthy?
Thank you. This one keeps coming back. And I note that obviously the change in the number of dwellings, while I agree that the at-surface amenity will be improved by having less garages and obviously less access points, which will give it a more pedestrian-friendly environment. I note it is a 147% of, so it's a 47% increase in the number of dwellings is my calculation, which is a considerable amount, and obviously a considerable amount of people in the location. There's nothing wrong with that. I suppose the question that arises though is in relation to the contribution to the local amenity. Can I ask?
Sorry, can we get to your question?
Can I ask through you to our officers whether there's been any increase in contribution as part of the application to the local amenity?
Yeah, I see your point.
Again, these will be matters that are considered during the planning permit stage, but I can talk generally what is going on with applications more broadly. There is a general contribution sought to direct amenity or streetscape upgrades, particularly around our major redevelopment sites where you're going from a relative low density to a high density. The obligations on the developers are generally less for these types of contexts, but it is expected they'd be contributing to curb, footpath improvements and landscaping at the street edge. And that's similar to what's occurring in the activity centres. And generally there's a willingness to partner with council to get a better visual presentation in our past experience, and we'd be confident that would continue through this process.
Great, thank you. Councillor Rennie, did you have a question?
Yes, through you, Mayor Lasserve. One of the things that was quite positive in the initial application was the balance of 1, 2, 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings, and that was spelt out quite specifically so that less than 30% of the dwellings in the initial development were 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings. With the proposal to move to 140, do we have any certainty about the balance of 1, 2, 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings, or has that certainty disappeared?
Through you, Mayor Lasserve, the understanding is there's not a definitive configuration yet of the dwelling typology, but in the general narrative for the application, one of the advantages that's promoted and expressed in the assessment report is there's been a stated intention to deliver an increased diversity. There was quite a dominance from the previous proposal of 3 and 4 bedrooms. There'll be an increased introduction of 2 bedroom dwellings, or the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Councillor Rennie?
Is there anything in this new proposal that would stop the developer coming back to us with a development that was primarily 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings? And what protections or certainty are there that we'll actually continue to get some 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings?
I think the nature of this area, and certainly the discussions we've been having leading up to this, has made it very clear through Council's housing strategy, through our municipal strategic statement, there is a requirement to deliver a diversity of housing types. I'm sure the applicant's representatives in the gallery tonight will convey that back to their client. Council's clear policy desire and direction for that diversity to remain. And certainly the discussions we've had with the applicant to date indicate a definite bias in this development towards a family style or larger home accommodation.
Thank you. Councillor Rennie?
A follow-on question. That's an issue that's of quite significant importance to me, noting that at the moment approximately 70% of the proposed dwellings are 3 and 4 bedroom, and I understand that that might be too high and that we might want to see more balance. But would it be possible to put in a condition that at least 50% of dwellings had to be 3 or 4 bedroom?
I'm in the hands of the Planning Committee, Mayor Lasserve, so if there's that desire, but generally the housing strategy doesn't call for that level of proportion for 3 bedroom. The genuine needs-based analysis actually says that the mix is probably more in the order of 70% for 2 bedroom dwellings in terms of new resident needs. It's a little bit more complex, and the other thing, and the difficulty with setting a limit, if the development's not acted on immediately, these types of things can change quite quickly. So I'd be recommending that the council give consideration to being flexible on that, and that that needs analysis should occur at the time of an application.
Okay. I guess just a follow-up question from me on that is it possible to actually put a condition like that in? For example, is it defensible? Not saying what percentage it would be, but...
You've probably got a hint from what I've said that it is difficult to do. Certainly if there is a total absence of a particular dwelling type and your evidence says otherwise, there's a strong case to apply it. I don't think a 50% contribution is necessarily supported by the data or evidence that we have available through our housing strategy. So to apply that, I would be cautious. And again, if I was the applicant's advocate at VCAT, I'd be referring to our housing strategy and I'd be referring to the evidence available at the time. And that's why our professional advice is that you probably need to be flexible. These things do change from time to time. There's definitely justification to express a provision of a range of dwelling types and bedroom sizes, bedroom numbers in dwellings. And it's a difficult position to argue an absolute definition of a provision at a particular point in time.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Councillor McCarthy.
Just a supplementary to the one I asked earlier. Just to be clear, any development contribution would be considered at the planning application stage rather than at the development plan stage. Is that
That's correct, and of course it's bound by the test where there has to be a demonstrated benefit. So that's why I was talking about directly adjacent.
Yep.
Not to. It's more difficult and problematic if it's to facilities in the general area.
Councillor McCarthy?
Yeah, look, I suppose just to follow on from what I've just heard, in relation to the application of those sorts of investments by the applicant, would reconfiguration of the road immediately fronting the site to support and deal with the traffic issues that may arise from the other activities in the street be considered a possible amenity improvement? I'm considering the semi-industrial high-frequency area directly opposite, which would be impacted because of this.
Where there are complications in the system, so it's all back to the need. It's the load that's generated by this development. So if the purpose is being done to accommodate traffic calming from traffic sources elsewhere, then it's difficult. If the treatments are largely driven to improve the aesthetics and the amenity of the site immediately adjacent, then it is far easier to do. And that's the distinction I can draw. So if those provisions are driven to deal with parking and off-site traffic and amenity impacts from elsewhere, it's difficult. But if it's a streetscape and aesthetic direct benefit to the contributing property, much easier to do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? No? Would someone like to move a motion? Councillor Rennie?
Yes, I'll move the motion as per the report.
Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Rennie.
Thank you. Notwithstanding some fears I have about what might come back, I think that I will take on board the advice that we've received and say that I do think one of the possible significant improvements that we might see in this new configuration doesn't just relate to parking but also to the accessibility of dwellings. And 3 or 4 level townhouses present very significant accessibility issues for people with limited mobility and can mean that those dwellings aren't suitable across the lifespan. So I would certainly hope that what comes to us at a later stage when we get a planning permit are dwellings that have extremely high levels of accessibility, and in particular I'd be disappointed to see split level dwellings which limit accessibility and are generally harder for people with mobility issues to live in. So I think that first and foremost is a very significant improver that we might see here. I'm also very keen not to see the dominant street frontage taken over by carports and garages. I think that, you know, we want this to be accommodation for people, not for their cars, and cars should be secondary in terms of what presents to people in this development. And I look forward, I suppose, in terms of this being 140 new homes for people in Northcote, to seeing a development of the highest possible standard in all respects. And I think that is the opportunity here, and that's certainly the type of thing I'd be expecting to come back to us when a planning permit application is put in. And what I mean by that is that visually I think we'd be expecting something pretty impressive in terms of the way it presents to the street and to the residents in the internal layout, that there is no reason for new development like this not to meet the highest standards of accessibility in terms of universal access for all residents. My understanding is doing that properly from the planning stage doesn't actually cost any more money, so it should just be a default. And the highest standards of environmental performance. And I think that that is something that can actually be really driven by these bigger developments so that they can set a new benchmark for everybody in this area. So on that basis, I look forward to 140 superb quality dwellings being built at some stage in the future in Northcote.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
I just note that at this location, which has obviously been on the agenda for a few years now, just next door we're looking at the 42 dwellings being the apartment building and the 20 townhouses being constructed. So we are seeing obviously a significant change at this location, and with this proposed amendment, an increase in the number of people and of course obviously the number of dwellings. I think we need to be really cognizant in considering support for this, that it doesn't become a gated community, it doesn't become shut off from the rest of the community, that the people that live here are going to be part of a broader network of a neighbourhood, and hopefully those connections are made much more clearer through the planning application process. One of my concerns with this application or with this development plan from the outset has been the issue around the pedestrianisation of the site and ensuring that it is not a great big driveway, but it is in fact somewhere which people walk around, walk through, and are connected in that way. So I actually welcome the proposed changes because I think they deliver a greater at-surface pedestrian environment and a safer environment with less crossovers. I am very wary about how that integration happens, and so I look forward to the planning application when it does arrive, because that will hopefully spell out that next level of detail, as well as how both council and the applicant consider making the local traffic arrangements work, not just for vehicles but also for pedestrians and cyclists, because Beavers Road is set to become a major through route for cyclists and pedestrians with the bridge being constructed. We need to think about the context, and that's what this development plan helps us to do.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Amir.
I just wanted to echo Councillor McCarthy's comments. When we have a site that's this large, it certainly provides a lot of opportunities that are not necessarily possible on a smaller site. And this one in particular is important because of the proximity to the creek, and we're going to get a lot more people coming through with the new bridge over Merry Creek at Beavers Road. It's also an area where, walking down Lines to Grove, it's very strong community feel, the school and the houses. And then once you hit that Beavers Road block at the moment, it does have that closed industrial site that we have now. So I'd be certainly looking forward to, I guess, an extension of that community vibe with the trees, where it's nice to walk and go jogging and be connected to the natural environment and that quiet, friendly suburban area in Northcote, to set a real example of the kinds of places that people want to live in. Thank you.
Any further speakers? Councillor Messina.
Just, I think, 3 words: community safety. So think about environmental layout, perhaps, of the people that are residing there. Graffiti management. I know it's not part of the planning, but just consider that. And waste management, if you could have a look at that once moving forward. And that includes the new e-waste ban that's coming into proposal on the 1st of July, and recycling. So I'd like to see some of those in the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. I will now put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. So the Planning Committee has decided to adopt the amended development plan. Could I just check with Mr Rudd, sorry, around the appeal rights? Yep. What is there appeal rights, and what are they?
The only appeal rights are available to the applicant, and there's a catch-all appeal provision.
Okay.
So, and they're usually if there's dissatisfaction with the conditions or the timeliness of a decision around a development plan.
Okay. So the applicant has 60, is it 60 days still? 60 days to appeal the decision?
Actually, no.
No, okay, so the applicant can appeal it at any time that they choose. Okay, thank you. The next item is other business. So 6.1 is general planning information scheduled VCAT applications. That's moved by Councillor Rennie, seconded by Councillor Mear. All those in favour? Motion is carried. Urgent business, is there any urgent business? No urgent business, and that brings us to the close of the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you, officers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My 7:30 meeting was cancelled, so I know probably no one's going to come.
You said that's a relief.
Who-